Thank you all for joining us today. A hartlichen Dank für sein mit uns heint. I am honored to welcome you to our annual memorial gathering here in Riverside Park, this year marking the 79th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. At long last, we gather under the open sky as we did prior to the COVID pandemic. What a pleasure to see you and be with you in person. Although we are children and grandchildren of survivors, we can only manage to comprehend the tiniest fraction of the fear, the horror, the despair that the Holocaust embodied. When you think of how our parents stared into the face of death every day for years, it can be enough to crush you. Yes, we were born from suffering, but we were also born from heroism. We come together at this simple, unpretentious stone, der Shteyn as we call it, to honor the extraordinary heroism of the fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Der Shteyn does not derive its poignancy from its grandeur, nor from the fact that it is a temporary marker embedded here in 1947 as a promise that a permanent tribute to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising would later be built. Der Shteyn derives its meaning from us, because it represents unspeakable horror and magnificent heroism, because it possesses the silent scream of death and the determination to fight against all odds and be able to say, we will choose the moment of our death, not the Nazis. I'd like to take a moment to thank the Parks Department staff, our own David Goldstick, who is here, and the Riverside Conservancy for taking such good care of our gathering place. And also a special thanks to Shane Baker, Fagela Jacobs, Irena Klepfish, and Moish Rosenfeld for coordinating our annual gathering. As this gathering is a memorial, we ask that there be no applause during our program. Today is April 19th, which 79 years ago fell on this first night of Passover when the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising began. The 19th marked the beginning of an epic battle, not for victory, as the resistance fighters knew from the outset, but for the honor of our people. At 2 a.m., lookouts spotted the German artillery approaching the ghetto, and they entered the ghetto at 4 a.m. By 7 in the morning, their battalions were in position inside and outside the walls of the ghetto. The Nazis used the intersection at Mila and Zamenhof streets to stage their assault, intentionally while everyone slept. But the band of resistance fighters were waiting for them. Hidden behind barricades at the four corners of the intersection, they suddenly opened fire with handmade Molotov cocktails and shots from their lone machine gun. Soon the street was littered with the bodies of Nazis. This is how it began 79 years ago today. And when the battle ended, Marek Edelman, one of the leaders of the Jewish Fighting Organization, wrote, on May 10th, 1943, this period of our bloody history, the history of the Warsaw Jews, came to an end. The site where the buildings of the ghetto once stood became a ragged heap of rubble reaching 3 stories high. Those who were killed in action had done their duty to the end, to the last drop of blood that soaked into the pavements of the Warsaw Ghetto. We who did not perish, leave it to you to keep their memory alive forever. Time and again, history shows us that the darkest moments give rise to opportunities for the greatest progress. Today, the people of Ukraine fight, as our brothers and sisters did, not only for their survival, but to preserve liberty. Led by Jewish President Volodymyr Zelensky, whose great-grandparents were killed after German troops burned their home to the ground during a massacre, the brave Ukrainian people are showing that the power of many, is greater than the will of one dictator. As it was in the Warsaw Ghetto, brutality will never grind down the Ukrainian people's will to be free. All of us must commit to do the hard work of protecting democracy, liberty, and freedom. The work is not easy, and there is always a price to pay, but it's a price we have to pay, because the evil that drives autocracy is ultimately no match for the glow of liberty that lights the lives of free people everywhere. Nations, like individuals, face moments of truth, moments in history, turning points which challenge our survival and the survival of our values. When we watch the news, it seems overwhelming and stifling. How can this be happening? How can people not have learned? Our collective decisions determine whether we emerge from those moments stronger, more resilient, or if they cause us lasting damage. Do we have the moral courage, irrespective of personal consequences, to act on what in our hearts we know to be right? Under these circumstances, our gathering and our message is more important than ever. We make the decision to come together today as a community and continue to return year after year to this simple stone to remember and to remind the world so it never forgets. Our parents and grandparents sang Zognik Kemol as the Geistem letzten Weg as they faced certain death. Never say this is the end of the road. And indeed we are here because our work has not ended. Our journey does not end until every person knows the story and the lessons of the Holocaust. Our journey does not end because their fight is our fight. Our journey does not end because the hatred that sparked the Holocaust continues today in so many places. Our journey does not end until every life flourishes in freedom. Wir seien da.
Please ask the people to keep out of the flower beds. There's so many people here that they're walking into the beds.
Wir seien da. Noch einmal und Tage noch einmal, again and again, dor v'dor, generation to generation. That is our legacy. May the invincible soul of those who perished and those who survived inspire us to be compassionate and to have the wisdom to find peace within and build peace between nations. The price of freedom is far less dear than the price of forsaking it. Long live their blessed memories. Kavod sei Gedenk. I ask before I introduce our guests to please be careful not to walk on the flower beds. Thank you. We ask our friend Zalmen Mlotek to come up. Zalmen is the artistic director of the National Yiddish Theater-Folksbiene and an internationally recognized authority on Yiddish folk and theater music and a leading figure in the Jewish theater and concert worlds. Zalmen?
Hello. Unter die khurves von Poyln, a Kopf mit blonde Haar, der Kopf und seine Churven, beide seinen vor. Dolle meine Dolle, dolle meine Dolle. Dolle meine Dolle, dolle meine Dolle. Über die Khurves von Poyln fällt und fällt der Schnee. blonder Kopf und mein Ego tut mir besuchen weg. Dolle meine Dolle, Dolle meine Dolle. Der Beyde sitzt beim Schreibtisch und schreibt allerhand Brief. Der Tränen seine Augen ist still und tief. Dolle meine Dolle, Dolle meine Dolle. Dolle meine Dolle, Dolle meine Dolle. Über die khurves und Poyln flattert der Vogel a große schiffe Vogel zittert mit den Flügeln flog. Dolle meine Dolle, Dolle meine Dolle. Der große schiffe Vogel meint der Schlamm der Mühl. Tragt auf seine Flügel das treue Lied. Dolle meine Dolle, Dolle meine Dolle, Dolle meine Dolle, Dolle
Dank, Zalmen. I'd like to take a moment to remember Mimi Ehrlich, who recently passed away and was always present here at our annual gatherings. We also remember Rachel Gurdus, who was active in the resistance in the Vilna ghetto and then in the woods outside Vilna. Here in America, she worked closely with Vladka and the Jewish Labor Committee's Holocaust Education Department. Rachel passed away last September, and now we welcome her son Ben Gurdus, who will read an excerpt in Yiddish from Vladka Mead's book, Von Beyde Zaytn geto-moyer.
In der Dosiker Wohnung hat mir sich ständig gekonnt der Wissen, die letzte von Jiddisch in Davke nicht von kein deutscher Quellen, noch direkt von Ausland. Der erste Mal, wenn Haver Klein hat mir angetan auf die Ohren, die Treiblich, und ich habe von England der Herd, die polnische Statie Schwit, hab ich aufgezittert. Am Modner Freit hat mir beherrscht. Es ist da etwas an anderer Welt, eine Welt von Deutschen. Mit angehaltenem Atem habe ich gehört in der polnischen Sprache die 15-minütige Auditie von London. Von über Grenzen, über Jahren, ruft man die polnische Bevölkerung zu ausdauern, nicht zu verzweifeln, nicht unterzugeben sich, nicht zu verlieren der Hoffnung. Die Zeit von Befreiung ruft sich an. Ich gucke auf die Stubeke. Ja, sie hören sich euch zu. In ihren Augen beweisen sich Tränen von Gerechtigkeit. Ich bin ein Stück gehört, gestreng an die Ohren. Efter weil ich habe es wegen uns, jeden der Herren. Man redet doch zum polnischen Volk. Zu denen wird nicht der Monende, welche blutigen am ersten, und die welche seinen am tragischen umgekommen. Emets singt der polnischen Zellnerisches Liedl,
A bissel hecher.
Emets deklamiert, die Auditie ist geendigt. Ich bin eine lange Weile geblieben in Loschen. Gemischte Gefühle von Freude und Zar haben mich beherrscht. Heißt, als wir seien nicht allein, es seien doch verbündete Freund, welche führen einen verbissenen Kampf gegen unsere gemeinsamen Söhne, gegen Deutsch. Aber für was dermont man nicht uns, das Recht Verblindene, was rangeln sich weiter? Wir seien doch noch da, es wenig, aber fort noch da.
Hashem Dank. And now I'd like to bring up our friend Stephen Mead, who translated his mother's book from the Yiddish, On Both Sides of the Wall, Memoirs from the Warsaw Ghetto.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Marcel. Vladka, my mother, was one of the couriers, these extraordinary, courageous young people, mostly young women, whose task was that on a daily basis, they had to carry weapons, ammunition, documents, communications, cash, and take care of finding hiding places for adults and children of the Jewish Reshklach, of those survivors. In short, their task was to do anything necessary to keep alive the remnant of Polish Jewry. I'm going to do a slightly shifted over part of my mother's book that Ben read, but I'll start it at a different point. We couriers were always carrying documents, money, illegal leaflets, and communications with the rest of the underground, both Jewish and Polish. We never knew when any of us might fail to elude a German patrol, a Gestapo raid, or a Lapanki, a roundup of Poles for slave labor, or fall into the hands of the Szmelkovniks, the blackmailers. Whenever we were on assignment, we were never sure that we would ever return. For most of us, our families were gone. Our friends and comrades had been killed. Who would notice if we ever returned? Who would look for us or try to get us released if we were arrested? We knew that our little group of comrades would notice and would do what they could, little as that might be, to help us. Whenever any of us appeared after a long absence, the greeting was always the same, an ironically loving, "So you're still alive? We thought you were lying on the ground already." These were, of course, bad times too. There was a particularly tragic time after we lost several of our comrades. Zygmunt Igla, Szmerke Kaczerginski, in an ambush, and we all felt bereft, hopeless. At Miodova 24, the rooms that we used as our one gathering place, the couriers would gather, and we would always feel that question in the air: which one of us will be next? In the end, we all knew that death would reach us, but amongst ourselves, we never discussed it openly. Now the part that was just read. David Klim had many contacts among the Poles, and was an important source of arms and ammunition for the ghetto. He also owned a radio. One could come up to his rooms, put on one of several headsets, and hear the latest war news, not only from German sources, but from the Allies as well. I remember the first time that Klim put on the earphones on me so that I could listen to the Polish radio station SWIT broadcasting from London. My eyes grew wide. I trembled with excitement and joy. Here I am, hearing from the world out there, a world beyond the Germans, beyond our borders and mountains and seas, where a Polish language broadcast continues for 15 minutes. There are calls to the Polish people to be strong, not to give up, not to give in, not to lose hope, the moment of liberation is sure to come soon. I look over at those next to me, they're listening too, and we all strain to catch every word of the broadcast, because maybe they do know in London. Maybe we will hear something about the plight of the Jews. The announcer speaks about the suffering of the Polish people. Surely they will mention the even greater suffering, the tragic destruction of our Jewish neighbors. But all that we hear is a female voice that sings a patriotic song, and another voice declaims a poem, and then the broadcast is over. For a long time I'm speechless. I swing between waves of joy and great rage. The broadcast tells us that we are not alone in the world, that we have friends out there, allies, engaged in a dogged campaign against the Nazi foe. But why not mention that to us, the few remaining Jewish survivors? Why not recall that we, who struggle here every day, need to go on just a little longer? Do we count for nothing? I want to scream back into the headphones. Is there no one listening? We, the Jews of Poland, are still here. True, we are few in number and in great pain, but we are still here. 74 years ago, the 5th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was marked with an akademia here on this very spot. And the shteyn was placed here as a promise, as Marcel said, that we would commemorate the heroism, not only of the fighters, but of all those who had struggled to maintain their menschlichkeit, their humanity, even in the face of certain death. The promise of this spot remains unfulfilled. Even after 79 years, even after coming here every year, it is still our yerusha, our imperative, our responsibility to complete the task of providing for an appropriate memorial here, to continue to tell the world that once there was a time and a place and a people who struggled and gave their lives to fulfill the promise and the prophecy, mir zaytn da.
Adank. I'd like to ask Shane Baker to come up. Shane is director of the Congress for Jewish Culture, der Jiddische Kulturkongress.
A greeting from David Rosenberg in London in the name of the National Committee of the Jewish Socialists Group in Britain. Tayere, I just wanted to extend greetings of love and solidarity for today's Warsaw Ghetto Uprising commemoration in New York from the Jewish Socialists Group in Britain. We are with you in spirit, always anti-fascist, mir zaytn da. And from Melbourne, der Melbourner Bund, der mahnt und anerkennt die Ghetto-Kämpfer, Partizaner und Frontkämpfer, was haben mit Mut und Heldigkeit sich genommen das Leben in der Hand, gedei sich wiederzustellen gegen die nazische Rotzchen. Wir ermannen mit tiefen Treue die ermordete 6 Millionen, hereingerechnet 1 Million Kinder oder mehr, wo seien umgekommen in unbeschreibliche Bedingungen durch Hunger, Krieg, Keulen und Gaskammern. Wir anerkennen mit Besteuerung die Scheres Pleite, was haben wir gelebt im Milchome und haben aufs Neue aufgebaut jüdische Kehilles, Institutions und ein Leben, gedei zu versichern dem Kiem von unser Volk nach dem 3. Khurven. Zusammen mit euch merken wir ob die dosige Date, gedei jede von die 6 Millionen und die Welt von wannen sie haben gestammt, so kann mal nicht vergessen werden. Was weiter die Geschehnischen fallen herein in der Geschichte, als wichtiger ist es, als wir sollen kein Mal nicht vergessen. Covid sehr Andenk, Bundische Organisation in Melbourne. And now to read a greeting from Warsaw, Irene Vladka, Vice Chair of the YIVO and a member of the board of the American Friends of the Poyln Museum.
This letter is from Marian Tursky. I think all of you know who he is. As I write this letter in Warsaw, I'm glad to think of you all gathered in New York on this day. You're here for a very particular reason, as every year we celebrate those who fought in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the first and largest Jewish uprising in German-occupied Europe. This year, however, you've been handed a yellow paper daffodil, a symbol which was created by the Poland Museum of the History of Polish Jews to represent the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising campaign. Every year, these paper daffodils are distributed by hundreds of volunteers on the streets of Warsaw to commemorate those who 79 years ago decided to resist. We commemorate not only those who fought with arms. For sure, you must be familiar with the monument to the ghetto heroes, which is facing our museum's entrance, especially those of you who've been to Warsaw. Everyone knows the front face. Everyone knows the front face, which depicts figures of fighters full of majesty and expression. However, there's also the lesser-known alternate side of the monument, which represents the figures of civilians, those who are not often mentioned, those who, according to some, went like lambs to the slaughter. Some of you may know as well that many years after the unveiling of the monument in Warsaw, Yad Vashem commissioned copies of the reliefs from the sculptor Natan Rappaport. He agreed, but under one condition, that the fighters and civilians would be presented on the same side in one row. Not everyone did or could fight with arms. In fact, there were not even enough available to equip all the fighters. Even so, each did what they could to try and thwart the Germans' plan to murder each and every last Jew and destroy every surviving fragment of Jewish culture from world heritage. So every surviving Jew and every piece of Jewish heritage thwarted that plan. For this reason, we must remember and recognize also the civilians who did not fight with arms, but who did everything they could to save Jewish lives and preserve Jewish culture. Today, and with the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising campaign, we commemorate both the fighters and the civilians. The motto of the campaign is remembering together. Our main duty is to remember them all, as many of their stories as we can. People ask me sometimes, how long will you, former prisoners, go on remembering and reminding others? I answer them, if you don't forget, then perhaps someday I won't need to speak. Thank you for remembering with me.
Thank you. And now I'd like to invite our friend Joanne Borts to come up. Joanne is a New York-based Broadway actor and singer who appeared in the Yiddish Fiddler on the Roof and also recently in the Broadway production of Once.
Please welcome Zalmen Mlotek. Thank you so much.
Unser Lied ist voll mit Treuer, der Geist ist unser Muntergang. Hotsch der Säune wacht beim Teuer, stürmt die Jugend mit Gesang. Weil jung ist jeder, wer es will, nur jung haben kein Bateit. Alte kennen euch sein Kinder von einer neuen, freie Zeit. Wer es wogelt auf Wegen, wer mit Dreistigkeit stellt sein Fuß, bringt die Jugend jemand gegen von dem Ghetto Ageros. Weil jung ist jeder, wer es will, nur jung haben kein Bateit. Alte kennen euch sein Kinder von einer neuen Mir gedenken alle Sonim, mir dermonen alle Freind, ewig wollen wir verbinden, unser Nächten mitten heint. War jung ist jeder, wer es will, nur jung haben kein Bateit. Alte kennen euch sein Kinder von einer neuer, freie Zeit.
I know you appreciate how brilliant she is, but we ask that you not applaud. Thank you. I'd like to introduce Judy Batalion, who will deliver our keynote address. Judy is a granddaughter of Holocaust survivors whose book, The Light of Days, The Untold Story of Women Resistance Fighters in Hitler's Ghettos, is a New York Times bestseller, was adapted into an award-winning children's book, will be translated into 21 languages, and was optioned recently by Steven Spielberg, for whom Judy is co-writing the screenplay. Judy?
Very short. Thank you. It is an honor for me to be here today. April 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Bundist Masha Führermilch climbed onto the roof of a building. She shook in excitement, so much so that it took extra time to light the match to ignite the wick of her explosive. At last, her partner flung the grenade at the Germans. A thundering explosion, falling Nazis, and then she heard one scream in disbelief, "Look, eine Frau kämpft! A woman is fighting?" Masha was awestruck. A sense of relief washed over her. She had done her part. My book, The Light of Days, tells the story of Jewish women who resisted the Nazis from the ghettos and forests in Poland. Acting often with youth movement undergrounds, these young women and teenage girls participated in a wide array of resistance activities. They hid revolvers in teddy bears, built underground bunkers, flirted with Nazis, bribed them with wine and sweets, and shot them. They planned uprisings, carried out intelligence missions, and were bearers of the truth about what was happening to the Jews. They helped the sick and taught the children. They organized soup kitchens, underground schools, and printing presses. They flung Molotov cocktails in ghetto uprisings and blew up Nazi supply trains in the forests. My central figure in the book, Renia Kukielka, was 15 years old when Hitler invaded. She escaped from her town's ghetto, fled through fields, jumped off moving trains, and, pretending to be Catholic, worked as a housemaid for a German family, nervously genuflecting at weekly church services. She managed to track down her sister Sarah, who was part of the Dror underground in the town of Beyde. When Renia arrived in Beyde, Dror was planning an uprising and needed information and supplies from Warsaw. None of the recent couriers had returned. There had been silence from Warsaw for weeks, and someone needed to go. They asked Renia to be a courier. Courier girls connected the locked ghettos. These young Jewish women dyed their hair blonde, took off their armbands, put on fake smiles, and pretending to be Christian, secretly slipped in and out of ghettos, bringing Jews information and hope, bulletins and false Aryan papers. They smuggled pistols, bullets, and grenades, hiding them in marmalade jars and in fashionable handbags. They also smuggled and hid Jewish children and adults. Jewish women were well positioned to do this performance work. They were not circumcised, so they did not risk being found out in a pants drop test. Before the war, many Jewish sons had been sent to private Jewish schools. Girls were often sent to Polish public schools. Girls became more assimilated and spoke Polish without the Yiddish accent. They were trained as girls to listen, to be sensitive to others' cues, to be flirtatious even. They were the perfect undercover spies who were not suspected. Renya said yes. At 18 years old, she became a courier girl and for 6 months ran secret missions between Warsaw and Beyde. On this first mission, Renya slipped money into her garter belt, slipped out of the Beyde ghetto, hired a smuggler to take her to the border of the general government, bribed a guard with whiskey, and took a train into Warsaw to find that the reason messages had not been coming from Warsaw was because the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising had begun. And I'm going to conclude by reading a brief excerpt of a number of excerpts of her account as a witness to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And this is based on my translation of a number of her testimonies. Warsaw was as disguised as Renya was, even more so. The spring sunshine, the stretching miles of low-rise buildings, the grand squares and buzzing street vendors were now obscured by a miasma of smoke and ash. Daily traffic was barely audible among the explosions and cries that she wrote sounded like the wails of jackals. The avenues were thick with the smell of burning buildings, burning hair. Drunken Nazis drove riotously through town. There were police checkpoints at almost every intersection, inspecting each package. Near the ghetto, each street was filled with German soldiers, tanks, buses, motorcycles. Nazis wore armored helmets and held weapons ready to pounce. The clouds were red, reflecting the flames of burning houses. The air was choked with screams. The closer Renya got to the Jewish quarter, the more shocking the shrieks. SS troops in full battle array stood opposite the ghetto wall. Machine gun muzzles protruded from the balconies, windows, and roofs of the adjacent Aryan-side homes. German planes swooped low, hurling bombs. Buildings crumbled into rubble. Floors collapsed, pillars of rising dust. The ghetto was completely surrounded. But Renya saw it for herself. In all this horror, Nazi tanks were being destroyed by Jews, by her people. Through the smoke, she could hazily make out young Jewish men with machine guns standing on the roofs of houses. She saw Jewish girls shooting pistols and hurling bottles of explosives. Small Jewish children, boys and girls, ambushed the Germans with stones and iron rods. Seeing the fight flare, Jews who were not part of any organization grabbed anything they could find and joined. The clash was tremendous. It seemed not merely that some Jews were fighting the Germans, Renya wrote, but that 2 entire countries were at battle. Shaken, still posing as a Catholic girl, Renya returned to her hostel. She tried to rest, but was tortured by her visions. I couldn't believe that I'd seen this with my own eyes. Could my senses have been fooling me? She asked herself. Were those tormented Jews, broken and decimated by hunger, really able to conduct such a heroic battle? But yes, she had seen it. The Jews picked themselves up and fought, she later wrote. They fought for liberty, justice, and the chance to die with dignity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy. And now we'd like to invite up Menachem Fox, and I guess Zalmen will be accompanying him as well. Menachem is a singer, songwriter, actor, and author who recently published his memoir, Becoming Ordinary, A Youth Born of the Holocaust, What I Kept, What I Let Go. Menachem?
A minor, yes? Let's try it.
Von die Ghettos schieße Wend in die wilde Freie, anstatt Keten auf die Hand, halt Abixer nahe. Der Faschist, der zittert herd, weiß nicht wovon Wahnen, stürmen wie von Unter, jeden Partisanen. Der Faschist, der zittert herd, weiß nicht wovon Wahnen, stürmen wie von Unter, jeden Partisanen. Sonne komme, hat da Sinn, wenn mit Butt beschreiten, fahr dem heiligen Bagin, reiß die Schreiten. Der Faschist, der zittert herd, weiß nicht wovon Wahnen, schummen wie von Unter, jeden Partisanen. Der Faschist, der zittert herd, weiß nicht wovon Wahnen, schummen wie von Unter, jeden Partisanen. Es wenig seinen Meeren Zoll, Dreister wie Millionen, reißen mir auf Wagenzoll, Bricken Eschalonen. Der Faschist, der zittert herd, weiß nicht wovon Wahnen, schummen wie von Unter, jeden Partisanen. Der Faschist, der zittert herd, weiß nicht wovon Wahnen, schummen wie von Unter, jeden Partisanen. Nein, wir werden Kämel sein, letzter Mohikaner. Es brennt die Nacht, die Sonne scheint, dem jedem Partisanen. Der Faschist, der zittert herd, weiß nicht wovon Wahnen, schummen wie von Unter, jeden Partisanen. Der Faschist, der zittert herd, weiß nicht wovon Wahnen, schummen wie von Unter, jeden Partisanen.
We welcome Sarah Aoki, a college activist, member of the Workmen's Circle College Network, and currently a student at NYU Tisch.
When Hitler invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, Adina Blady-Zweiger was a 22-year-old medical student. Still, she managed to finish her medical studies during the first year of the war and immediately began practicing in the Warsaw Ghetto, caring for children of the ghetto. She did this under the direction of Dr. Anna Broadheller. Before the war, Dr. Broadheller was already a revered pediatrician who had been active in the establishment of the Medem Sanatorium in Otwock and a children's hospital in Warsaw, a hospital which she continued to head in the ghetto. Dr. Broadheller died during the uprising. How and when is unknown. Using Aryan papers provided by the ZOB, Adina Zweiger left the ghetto before the uprising and became a Bund courier. She continued this work for a year till the Warsaw Uprising. She was one of the few Jews who survived both the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943 and the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. In her memoir, I Remember Nothing More, The Warsaw Children's Hospital and the Jewish Resistance, Adina Zweiger documents her work with Dr. Broadheller and her work as a courier. The following is an excerpt in which she describes how she distributed money to Jews in hiding, including other Jewish resistors. The couriers tended to work in pairs, and Marisha is Adina's roommate and partner in this work. The everyday life of a courier girl. A foggy day in autumn. October, November, certainly the autumn of 1943. I wake up. It is unpleasant. I have an awful feeling that something unpleasant is going to happen. Marisha has already got up. She has put water on for tea. In our household, Marisha is sensible, domesticated, and caring. I don't cope well with the small necessities of life. Get up, you have to leave soon, Marisha says to me. I know now. It is the beginning of the month. I have to collect the money from Senatorska Street. 1 million zlotys. Not just a huge sum, but also an enormous package of paper money. 1,000 zloty notes, or 2,500 zloty notes. I dress appropriately, putting on 2 layers of clothes. 1 pair of knickers with an elastic around my thighs underneath my suspender belts, the other pair on top, and 2 blouses. 1 underneath tightly drawn into the waist with a wide belt, and also a shopping bag with a false bottom. These were bags used by the resistance, messenger girls' bags. The people in the streets knew about them, but the Germans never seemed to realize. And just like that, I went to Senatorska Street. The money was already there, and my boss tried to hurry me. He wanted me to get out of his place with this burden as soon as possible. I was in a hurry. I suddenly realized that I was putting all 3 packs into my underclothes and down the front of my blouse into my knickers, while he was standing and looking at me, and that neither of us was the least bit concerned by it, neither he nor I, as if he had not been a man, as if I had not been a woman. Walking up the streets to the small shop on Miodowa Street, I slipped in the mud and fell to my knees. I knelt in the mud, frozen with terror. I got up as if I were made of glass. But everything was all right. I reached home. At home, the most convenient place to lay out the money was on the bed. I sat among this vast sum of money, counting it and dividing it into piles. For Vladka, for Selka, for Krisha. Every pile was the only means of support for 50 to 100 people for a month. I divided up this money and put it into piles, wrapping each pile separately. On Argova Street lived a family, just 2 people, mother and daughter. They were staying with a working-class family pretending to be relatives, expelled from Germany. The mother worked somewhere as a servant, I think. The daughter was 14 or 15 years old. Her father had found lodging somewhere else. The girl was pale and anxious, and she milled around as though she wanted to tell me something. "What's the matter, Mirka?" She blushed. "Tell me, I'm in a hurry." "I would like something to read," she stammered finally. "There's nothing here." I didn't know what to say. I wasn't allowed to go too often to secret addresses, as it would be unsafe for those who were hiding there, but I couldn't refuse her. She was an intelligent girl. For her, books were as important to life as bread. "I'll bring some for sure." I managed to keep my word. On several occasions, I brought her a few books I had bought in a second-hand bookshop. For some reason, we had to separate her from her mother. They had to change their lodgings because the neighbors had started to be suspicious, and I lost direct contact with her. Marisha used to visit her, but I don't remember whether she mentioned anything about books for Mirka.
Thank you, Sarah. And now we welcome Shifee Losacco. Shifee has sung with choirs and as a featured soloist at Lincoln Center Yiddish Theater Productions on Broadway, is currently a soloist with the piece of Heart Choir. Shifee and Zalmen.
Läuft die Zweigen, schlaf mein Teierkind, bei dein Wegel auf dein Nare, sitzt der Fremde und singt, bei dein Wegel auf dein Nare, sitzt der Fremde und singt. Liu, 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 liu. Flocken von Glück und dein Mame, oi, dein Mame, komm schon, komm nicht zurück. Und dein Mame, oi, dein Mame, komm schon, komm nicht zurück. Gesehen dein Taten läufen unter Hof und Stehen. Über Felder ist geflogen sein verjossente Geweih. Über Felder ist geflogen sein verjossente Geweih.
And now we ask Maida Feingold to come up. Maida is an accomplished singer and guitarist who performs with traveling Yiddish theatrical groups and in solo concert, accompanied by Zalmen.
Die Nacht ist uns gestern und der Frost hat stark gebrannt. Sie gedenkst du, wie ich hab dich gelernt. Halt das Feuer in die Hand. Sie gedenkst du, wie ich hab dir gelernt. Halt das Feuer in die Hand. A Moid, a Pelzol und a Beret und halt in Hand fest an a Gun. A Moid mit a sarnetenem Honin. Heat up dem Säunes Karawan. Gezielt, geschossen und getroffen hat ihr kleinen Kerbesäul an heute Flinken mit Waffen verhalten hat sie mit einer Keul. Vertag von Walreis gekrochen, mit Schnee gerlungen auf die Haare, gemutigt von kleinen Kennitzachen, war unser neuen freien Gar. Gemutigt von kleinen Kennitzachen, war unser neuem freien Dar.
Herzlichen Dank. Now we invite Eleanor Reissa to come up. Eleanor is a daughter of survivors and works professionally as a playwright, director, actress, and singer. She'll be reading from her recently published memoir, The Letters Project, A Daughter's Journey. Eleanor.
Thank you. My father, Haskell Schlisselberg, born in 1901, lived through the Holocaust in Auschwitz and on the Death March. My mother, born in 1923 or 4, lived through the Holocaust in Uzbekistan. When she died in 1986, I found 56 letters in German in her lingerie drawer. And that's where the book, The Letters Project, begins. It wound up opening a closet full of things that I didn't know about my father, my family, the Holocaust, and of course myself. It's been more than 2 years since I was in Germany. Before I went there, I knew nothing. Now, I know a little bit more than nothing, but still not everything. The darkness that has been with me all of my days is clearer now, more defined, based on facts rather than shapeless shadows. The sources of my sorrow are labeled and filed and have a beginning, although not an end. That will die when I die. There is also a reawakened paranoia. My senses are more alert to nationalism and bigotry. The sounds of marching boots and the smoke in the distance make me wonder about packing my bags and when and where to flee if the bastards get too close again. What means too close? I am witnessing history mutate and repeat. So soon? I am certain, even though I am not a scientist and even though I have done little research, that my own rage, of which there is plenty, and my existential fear and consciousness of death, and my sarcasm and greed and empathy, all of these things and more come directly from the womb in which I was born. My genes contain the chromosomes of memory, their memory. My parents' memory, my chromosomes remember. The years of starvation, the years of freezing, the years of beating, the constant flinching, waiting for the next blow, preparing for the pain, the trauma of being whipped on the bock, the hiding and the smoking and the clipping of hair and sleeping on wooden shoes and being secretive and being wily and being scared to death and scared of death. My radar is locked onto the stink of anti-Semitism and racism, as well as the cruel arbitrariness of extermination. A simple turn to the right or the left can hasten the end or can equal the end. How can you ever be careful enough? That my father felt that I was the reincarnation of his first daughter, Frida, saddened and surprised me. Yet I felt that too, that I had been given her life, that all of her bits and pieces had magically, karmically recombined to become me, that the cosmos would not permit her to die forever because her life was stolen. The crime was corrected. I am the correction. I am Frida's justice, Frida's revenge. My life is revenge. That's one part of this takeaway, the part about me, about how and who I am and why. Is my anger and irreverence a bit more understood now? Forgiven? I hope so. There is something else, though, something I've been holding inside for these 2 years, waiting for this moment to say, here and now. I will repeat these words again and again until the very end of my days. My father and the others who lived and died during that time, in that place, were not survivors. No, I reject that term. Those people did not survive. Dogs survived, cows survived. What those people did, all of them, not just the ones in the ghetto or the forests or the basements or the camps, was fight. They were fighters. Whether they lived or were killed, they fought. With every molecule of their breath and brain and brawn, they fought to live with all their might and their heart and prayers and selflessness and selfishness and guns and books and pens and bread. They were Holocaust fighters, not survivors. In the cattle cars up the chimneys, in the attics and tunnels and sewers, they fought for their lives, for our lives, for my life. I am not the child of Holocaust survivors, no. I reject that. I reject that passive, minimizing, head-bowing term. My father never bowed down his head, he said. Well, why should I? Why should we? Words count. I, Eleanor Reissa Schlüsselberg, am the daughter of Holocaust fighters, courageous humans who fought the devil like hell for life to the death. Can you imagine if the world had called them Holocaust fighters, to have been the daughter of fighters rather than the daughter of survivors? I would have been Supergirl, for goodness sake, strong and proud rather than an ashamed hidden light. In its early days, the state of Israel marginalized Yiddish. In fact, there was a time that it was forbidden. It was considered a joke language, a language of the victim. It reflected a time of weakness when Jews went like sheep to the slaughter. From today's observatory that looks like arrogance and gall, perhaps it was just ignorance or blindness. The tenacity and resourcefulness of the Israeli rests squarely on the unacknowledged shoulders of those people who were hunted, starved, burned, shot, gassed. I spent my life as an embarrassed child of an other, of a man I perceived as a powerless victim with false teeth and a funny accent who accidentally had some good, horrible luck and lived. Sheep? No, no way. Tenacious, instinctual, smart, brave, greedy to live. That's where I come from, who I come from, who so many Jews come from.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. The words for our two closing songs appear in transliteration on the back of your program. Please stand as Zalmen leads us in singing the Partizaner hymn and the Bundische Schwur. I'm going to be all by myself up here. This is no good. You better sing.
Sollt nicht einmal, als du gehst den letzten Weg, hat Schimmeln bleien nicht verstellen, bleie Tag. Kommen wird noch unser ausgedenktes Jahr. Es wird ab heute an unser Trocken sein da. Kommen wird noch unser ausgedenktes Jahr. Es wird ab heute an unser Trocken sein da. Von grünem Palmenland bis weißem Land von Schnee. Wir seien da mit unserem Heim, mit unserem Weg. Und wo gefallen sie, spritzt von unser Blut. Sprotzen wenn dort unser Geburt, unser Mut. Es sind die Morgensonne bei Gilden unserem Heid. Und der Nächten wird verschwinden mit dem Feind. Da heute versammeln wird die Sonne in dem Kajor. Wie ein Parauso ging das Lied von Ort zu Dort. Geschrieben ist das Lied mit Blut und nicht mit Blei. Es ist mit kein Lied von Erfolg und läuft frei. Das hat der Volk zwischen Frau und Wind gebändigt. Das Lied gesungen mit Naganes in die Hand. Das sag nicht einmal, als du gehst den letzten Weg. Schimmeln bleien, verstellen bleie Tag. Kommen wird doch unser ausgedenkte Schau. Es wird ab heute an unser Tag wir seinen Tag. Kommen wird noch unser ausgedenkte Schau. Es wird ab heute an unser Tag wir seinen Tag. Schwester von Abend to night, alle verseinen, sie seht und sie straight, zusammen, die Bahn ist great, sie flattert viel Sorgen, Blut ist sie weit, ich schwöre, auf Leben und Teut. Freiheit und Grenzen zum Bund. Doch erkennt die Schlafen, befreien hat sie von die heute ist heut und weg. Sie flattert von Zorn, von Blut ist sie weit. Ach schwur, auf Leben und Treu.
Thank you so much for joining us today. On behalf of our organizing committee, Shane Baker, Fegele Jacobs, Irena Klepfish, myself, Marcel Kshensky, and Moshe Rosenfeld, I'd like to thank all our participants for creating this event. Feel free to pick up a copy of the 2018 publication we released on the occasion of our 75th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. There are a few copies left at this table. And please join us as we lay flowers at the shteyn, but we're just going to move the wires, so give us a second, and then we'll open up the gate. Thank you so much for joining us.